So I want to come to Pakistan. Before my question on the Pakistan-TTP relationship, I would like to know your comments about the recent developments in Balochistan.
Yeah, I mean, this is this is very concerning. It's not that we've seen very large protests that really have been triggered by concerns about governance and repression and so on. And it's very significant that you had this major protest in Gwadar, which of course is seen as the one of the cornerstones of the CPEC project. I think symbolically that's very important, and I think the protesters did that intentionally, knowing that that would make the Pakistanis nervous because of not wanting the Chinese to get nervous. The Chinese are already nervous about their security interests in Pakistan because of a series of terrorist attacks that have targeted their people in recent years. This is not new. I mean, we know there's been mass protests in Baluchistan in the past, but I think that what makes it particularly significant this time around is that we're seeing this broader groundswell of anger in Pakistan across the country directed at the state, at the civilian and military leadership. There have been large protests on the other side of the country, so to speak, in the northwest in KP. There have also just been, as you know, a lot of anger, broad and a malaise, so to speak, a lot of unhappiness about how things are going in Pakistan because of an economic crisis, political paralysis, the return of militancy, mistrust in institutions like the military, the courts. So I think that if you look at what's happening in Baluchistan, it's a symptom of a wider problem playing out across the country. Now, Pakistan is not a country that has a tradition of nationwide mass protests. It doesn't have that tradition. But I think that it should be concerning for the civilian and military leadership, especially after an election which was very, very flawed and rigged, quite frankly. So, the civilian leadership doesn't have much legitimacy. The military leadership is facing a lot of anger, and this is driven in great part by the Imran Khan factor. So, yeah, I think that what's happening in Baluchistan is and should be seen as a concerning thing for the leadership.
Interesting, you mentioned the legitimacy of the government because I want to come to the topic of the survival of the Shehbaz Sharif government. And I want to also ask you about your recent article 2 months back where you wrote about Pakistan's new counter-terrorism strategy. You mentioned that Pakistan is likely to pursue more intelligence-based operations and that China was a factor of well. So, in the long term, do you think the strategy is likely to be successful because the TTP is been growing and increasing its attacks because the Taliban have consolidated their power in Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, Pakistan has a really big problem, and it's an ironic problem too, of course. That it's been depending on the Afghan Taliban, its longtime ally, to help it address its concerns about TTP. But the Afghan Taliban hasn't done that because it's closely allied with the TTP, and the Afghan Taliban never turns on its militant allies, never, and that includes Al Qaeda among others. So you then have this new counterterrorism strategy. What's interesting about the strategy is how Pakistani officials have been repeatedly walking it back. At first we heard that it was going to be this big new strategy with kinetic operations and so on, and then you start hearing officials say, "No, no, we're not going to see kinetic operations. It's not going to be anything new. It's just going to be something more robust from what we already have. More intelligence operations can be kinetic operations for sure, right? I mean, cross-border operations can be undertaken by intelligence forces, so to speak. But yeah, I think the risk for Pakistan is that if it does increase its cross-border strikes, I mean, it's done this before. It risks inflaming its already strained relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And the Afghan Taliban may not have the capacity to actually fight a war against Pakistan, but it could respond with force. And I think that the even bigger concern for Pakistan is if it stages cross-border strikes on TTP targets in Afghanistan, the TTP could retaliate against Pakistan and perhaps even changing its strategy. To this point has only been targeting the military and security forces. It doesn't target civilians as much, but it could start doing that as well. Not to mention the TTP's main base is now in Afghanistan, but it does have a presence in Pakistan as well across the border. So even if TTP targets are getting hit in Afghanistan, that could really galvanize TTP cadre inside Pakistan, which could lead to even bigger problems for the Pakistanis. And I think that Pakistan is not getting the help it's looking for from outside. I mean, the U.S. I think is reluctant to. I mean, it's willing to talk to Pakistan about counterterrorism concerns. There's been a CT dialogue, but if the U.S. is out of Afghanistan, its main focus is on Islamic State. Again, ironically, the U.S. feels that the Afghan Taliban, have done a good job of degrading the Islamic State Khorasan threat in Afghanistan. TTP is a concern, but not a huge concern because the TTP doesn't target the U.S. anymore. U.S. security aid to Pakistan has been suspended for 6 years, more than 6 years. Um, and I don't think the U.S. would want to do anything in terms of CT cooperation with Pakistan that could lead it to become a threat. That could lead the TTP to turn its guns on the U.S. again. So this all suggests to me that Pakistan is going to be in on this alone. Yes, the Chinese could be an interesting factor here because it's true that the Chinese share, they share Pakistan's view that the TTP threat has to be dealt with because it threatens China and Pakistan. It also could threaten China in Afghanistan, a country where China would like to be more present with investments. It wants to work with the Afghan Taliban. Um, but the question is, what would Beijing actually do? China is not going to provide military support in this regard, but I think maybe where China could be useful is in getting through to the Afghan Taliban diplomatically. China has leverage over the Taliban that Pakistan does not these days because China has money to spend, capital it wants to deploy in Afghanistan. And the Taliban knows that the Chinese are willing to engage and come very close to formally recognizing the Taliban government. So that's why I think that China could be potentially the dark horse candidate, so to speak, to help Pakistan address these concerns it has about terrorism in Afghanistan.
True. I think that's a very illuminating answer on how Pakistan has to deal with the TTP problem. So I just want to ask you about your opinion about Pakistan's economic future because it recently received some relief from the International Monetary Fund.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is if Pakistan could get out of the cycle that it's been in for decades, where it struggles economically, it takes on IMF support, which gives it some breathing room. It upholds these conditions that the IMF puts in place for receiving money, which includes austerity measures, bringing on more revenue, cutting out subsidies. But then after a while, it reneges on all those obligations, and then it never completes the IMF programs, and then the cycle plays out again. Yeah, the problem is, I mean, it's a very complex problem, but Pakistan has declined to carry out structural reforms that not only the IMF want to see, but also other key donors, certainly the US and China for that matter, the Gulf states in terms of strengthening, widening the tax base, carrying out reforms in the agricultural sector, growing out the private sector so that you have a more diversified export base that goes beyond textiles. And these things have not happened. And so the question is, will Pakistan do that? To this point, what we're seeing is more of the same. The army is now very involved in economic policy more than it typically is. It's established this new entity called the Special Investment Facilitation Council. I think that's what it's called. It's meant to fast track investment opportunities by removing bureaucracy and so on. Well, that's a good thing that if it's in a position to bring in more support money from the Gulf states and elsewhere, but that's not really going to work if the structural issues are not addressed. So I really worry about the longer term. You can only get away with this for so long. And the other issue I mentioned here is that for many years, Pakistan's leadership would make this argument that its donors really need to help it out. They really need to help with financial support, with military support, because if they don't, things will get a lot worse in Pakistan. It would collapse. Terrorists would take over, that type of thing. And this is an argument that the military leaders have used in the past. Pervez Musharraf was very good with this argument. But that argument, this too big to fail argument, no longer works, right? Because we've seen that the Chinese, the Saudis, were notably slow to respond to Pakistan's latest appeals for assistance when Pakistan was really going through a bad economic spell last year when it was close to a default. They're starting to come around now, but still a bit of hesitation. So I think that should be a big lesson for the Pakistani leadership as well, that it can't necessarily depend on the outside world to help it. And there's some observers that argue that Pakistan may benefit from a default. If it faces that type of economic collapse, that would be the type of tough love that would wake it up to the need to finally take the big steps, the structural reform steps that could finally solidify the economy and make it stronger over the long term. In other words, it needs a wake up call posed by a default. Though, of course, if that were to happen, it would place tremendous hardships on the Pakistani people. We saw what happened in Sri Lanka when that country experienced its own default some years ago.
So it remains to be seen how Pakistan is going to come out of this economic turmoil